Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Australia-India Institute, welcome to this address tonight by our very distinguished guest, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. This is one of very many events that's being run by the Australia-India Institute in our job of deepening the engagement and the relationship between Australia and India, and Indians and Australians. I hope you're all regular visitors to our website, and I hope you're all signed up to come to our conference at the end of October, which will be a great event. There's a number of people I'd like in particular to welcome here tonight. I'd like to welcome Dr. Bahara, Mrs. Bahara, if she's here. She's not here. Dr. Bahara is the Consul General for India in Victoria. Welcome to Professor Gareth Evans, Chancellor of the ANU and a Fellow of the India Institute. A number of other people, I see Fellows of the Australia-India Institute. Welcome to you all. I'd like in particular to welcome back to Melbourne, Shashi and Sunanda. We're sorry the weather is not quite conducive to walking through the parks, but it's spring in Melbourne, and that's what happens. Dr. Tharoor is a very, I think many of you are aware, has been a very distinguished diplomat. He was for a while the Under Secretary General at the United Nations. He was Minister for State for External Affairs in India for a while. He's a Member of Parliament from Kerala. He's a prolific writer. He's a newspaper columnist, commentator. He's written many books, numbers of works on fiction, political biography, international relations, current affairs. One Treasure is a book that he co-authored on Pakistan and India cricket. And he's written another book, which is what is here tonight as part of the launch of that, Pax Indica, India and the World in the 21st Century. He'll address us tonight for 40 minutes maybe, and then less maybe, and then there'll be a chance for questions and answers, and that'll be conducted by the director of the Institute, Professor Amitabh Mattoo. So on behalf of you all, welcome. Please welcome our distinguished guest tonight, Dr. Tharoor.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction, and wonderful to see you all here this evening. I have really come back to Melbourne with my wife almost a year to the day from our previous visit, which was under the auspices of the Australia-India Institute. I'm actually here to deliver something called the Garan Oration at tomorrow's conference of the Institute of Public Administration of Australia. And Amitabh very graciously has offered me this opportunity to present my new book to all of you, an audience in Australia interested in India. The title, I think, is the first thing I should talk about. Pax Indica is not meant to evoke Pax Romana or Pax Britannica. There is not a hint of world domination that I'm trying to suggest in the title. Not only is India a particularly unqualified candidate for world domination, I don't really think there is much of a call for any of that. I think we are moving gradually to an era beyond superpowers. I think even the term superpower will be seen as a relic of the second half of the 20th century, perhaps the very beginning of the 21st. We have the one surviving superpower that's clearly getting more and more fatigued with its exercise of global responsibility, and the other rising power in China, which I don't think in its wildest aspirations has any intention of acquiring the sort of capacity that the superpowers had in the second half of the 20th century of affecting events half a world away. I don't think the Chinese are ever going to change a government in Guatemala or Ecuador or whatever. And I think in those circumstances, when I speak of a pax of any sort, I speak of a peace system of networked cooperative relationships in the 21st century, for which the most appropriate metaphor is probably that of the World Wide Web. The web, in some ways, because it connects us all together across various boundaries, suggests to me a world in which countries will be connected to each other through multiple configurations, permutations, and combinations through which they pursue their interests in different ways. And in fact, if I take India as an example, since this book is about India, it's instructive that India is simultaneously a member of the non-aligned movement, which reflects its anti-colonial heritage, and of the community of democracies alongside many of the Western democracies which were once imperial powers against whom it rails in the non-aligned movement. Or that it's simultaneously a member of the G77, the global trade union of developing countries, and at the same time that of the G20, which is the global management of the macroeconomic system of the world. That it has to focus, on the one hand, on its aspirations of the United Nations, all 193 countries, and simultaneously on its own neighborhood, the 8 countries of the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. And if you look at specific countries, we meet every year at foreign minister level with the Russians and the Chinese in something called RIC. We add the Brazilians and South Africans, and then we have BRICS. Then we take away the Russians and the Chinese, and we have IPSA for South-South cooperation. And then we add the Chinese but don't add the Russians, and we have BASIC for environmental negotiations. And India is an indispensable member of all of these configurations, not only because its name begins with that vital element in every acronym, a vowel, but because it is of some value to each of these groupings, and it pursues its own interests in cooperation with others. As I said, sometimes there are overlapping memberships, sometimes they're not, but this element of cooperation is the nucleus of the system, of which India, in my view, is a linchpin, not the sole linchpin, that I have dubbed, in this case, Pax Indica. And I've tried through the book to describe India's external orientations, its foreign policy relationships in the second decade of the 21st century from this perspective, but from a couple of other perspectives as well. One is not the perspective of a former UN official or even former minister of foreign affairs, but much more that of a member of parliament from a constituency in India, Thiruvananthapuram, which despite being the capital of Kerala, is in fact 2/3 a rural constituency. And I asked myself, what does foreign policy mean to an ordinary voter there, to a fisherwoman in Thiruvananthapuram? How does foreign policy affect or help her? And I try and argue through this book that foreign policy indeed, and it's probably true of every country, but I make the case for India, is no longer purely foreign, that it affects us in India wherever we live, that in our increasingly globalized world, we have no choice but to be deeply connected to the rest of the world. That too, by the way, is a transformation in India, because India, at the time of independence, chose not to integrate itself deeply into the international economic system. It rather threw up the protectionist barriers and subtracted itself from that system. Why? Because the Indian nationalists were acutely conscious that the British East India Company had come to trade and stayed on to rule. And therefore they were deeply suspicious of international capital. They saw every foreigner with a briefcase as a thin end of a neo-imperial wedge. And the suspicion, because of their historical experience, was that anybody who wanted to trade with you or sell goods to you or invest in you actually really wanted to rule you, which only goes to show that one of the lessons you learn from history is that history can sometimes teach you the wrong lessons. But nonetheless, in 1991, after a first-class financial crisis, we opened up our economy, liberalized it, and began to connect ourselves much more to the international globalized economy. And today India is a very globalized country. Much of its growth has come as a result of the connections that have been made possible through modern technology to the rest of the world. Everything from call centers and business process outsourcing to the kinds of research and development that young, bright Indians are doing for Western companies in India. And I argue that the younger generation in India today, some of whom are well represented here as I see, are going to grow up into a world in which they will be working in an environment where they have to deal with foreigners, will have to engage with people half a world away perhaps, have to eat unfamiliar food, speak foreign languages regularly to get along, get through their work, and indeed travel abroad for more for more foreign holidays, kinds of things that were not possible very easily or commonly for my generation or the one that preceded it. And that too is part of India's challenge. So I argue that given this perspective, that the purpose of India's foreign policy must be to promote the domestic transformation of India. That is to ensure through policy the creation of an environment, both to protect, of course, the average Indian, and at the same time to promote his or her prospects for a decent life, to promote the abolition of poverty in India, to promote development in India, to try and ensure that foreign policy serves as an essential tool to ensure the welfare and the prosperity of the ordinary Indian voter. And in that spirit, I look at relations with countries which are important sources of investment for us, countries which are important partners in trade. Trade is becoming more and more important in our foreign policy, far more than it used to be, say, in the 60s or 70s. I look at relationships with countries that are vital sources of energy security. We import more than 70% of our energy consumption, so we need relationships with countries from which it comes. And, of course, we also need relationships, increasingly, with countries that are going to be sources of our food security, because our own domestic demand for food and our capacity to consume it as our incomes go up is vastly outstripping the available supply in India. And so suddenly we find ourselves needing relationships with countries, for example, which may export food to us, or maybe we might even acquire large tracts of land to grow food in those foreign countries for consumption in India. Patterns of conduct we hadn't thought about in the past. So all of these elements, it seems to me, become vital. At the same time, I argue that India, because internationalism has been hardwired into our DNA since the days of Jawaharlal Nehru, our first Prime Minister, who in his historic Tryst with Destiny speech at the moment of independence, that midnight moment when partition scarred the land, when Pakistan was hacked off the stooped shoulders of India by the departing British, when a million people were killed in the ensuing violence and riots, 13 million lost their homes, the flames of this sectarian savagery were spreading across the land. Even in the midst of all that, Nehru managed to spare a thought for the world in his speech when he said that his dreams were not just for India, but for the world, because the countries of the world, he argued, are knit together by bonds so indissoluble that it is impossible for us to live apart or think of each other apart. An idea which, of course, was prescient in its time, though Wendell Willkie, the Republican presidential candidate in 1940, was probably the first one to articulate it, the one world idea. But we have now clearly got into a situation which in every respect has knit us together so closely as a globe that there are now more and more common challenges we have to face. In the days when I was at the United Nations, when I knew Gareth Evans, we used to talk about problems without passports, the kinds of problems that cross all frontiers uninvited. Problems like the environment, refugee movements, human rights issues, child trafficking, drug trafficking, international crime, and of course, above all, environmental issues, which by definition no one country or one group of countries, however rich or powerful they might be, could solve on their own. And those problems require international cooperation. India, for many years, was what we would call a rule taker in the international system, a country that had newly won its independence, that was, on paper, a founding member of the United Nations, but joined the United Nations really while it was still under the colonial tutelage of the British. And it went on increasingly to play an important role in the world stage. Today, I would argue that from being a rule taker, it is now in a position to contribute to being a rule maker in international affairs, to actually make a difference on these problems without passports. The ones I've already mentioned and the ones I haven't yet mentioned, because they are the 21st century issues that are rising today. Everything from outer space to cyberspace, in which India, because of its technological capacity, its own experience, its own abilities, can make a useful contribution to helping fashion rules of the road for the world. So this is very, very broadly what Pax Indica tries in its 450-odd pages to lay out. There are chapters on individual country relationships because one can't escape them. So there's a chapter on our relationships with Pakistan, another one with China, with the US, a chapter on our South Asian neighborhood, which is of such great importance to India, a chapter on our near abroad, Southeast Asia on the one side, West Asia on the other, one on our, what can I call it, our soft power, Joseph Nye's wonderful concept, which I have been applying to India for the last decade, and I spoke about when I was in Australia, in Melbourne, just a year ago. And of course, I also put in a chapter on the domestic underpinnings of our external policy, in particular, the role and functioning of the Ministry of External Affairs. And I argue in particular that given the scale and aspirations of Indian foreign policy in today's increasingly globalized world, that our ministry is grossly understaffed and under-resourced. We have, for a population of 1.2 billion people with over 141 diplomatic legations around the world, we have a foreign service that is fewer than 900 people. And that compares not to Brazil at 1,200, or China at 4,200, or Britain with 6,000, or the United States with 20,000 diplomats. In fact, the United States has more professional diplomats at its embassy in New Delhi than the entire Indian Foreign Service has around the world. It compares instead to tiny island nations like Singapore and New Zealand. Singapore has 867. And that's sort of the kind of level at which India pegs itself. And I find that deeply dismaying, and I argue that there is a need to expand that dramatically. I also argue that there is a need for immediate expertise. The need to expand the service has been recognized, at least in part, but the expedient to resolve this problem is the time-honored bureaucratic expedient of simply adding to the intake every year by recruiting more youngsters, which means by the time they are trained and experienced enough to be any use, it's going to be at least another decade, whereas the gaps in our performance that we need to fill are today. And I argue that, for example, the crippling lack of Spanish speakers or the lack of climate change experts, increasingly specialized field, or the lack of experts on Balochistan, whatever that may be, and there are many other such gaps, can only be filled by going out into the outside world, into other government departments if possible, but otherwise into universities, into the private sector, and finding experts who can be brought in on five-year contracts, 10-year contracts to fill these gaps now. Of course, there's tremendous resistance to that in Dr. Behera's ministry. I have, as a member of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs, helped push the idea through, so the ministry is now obliged to take the idea seriously and respond to it. But it is a matter of some concern that a country with our international responsibilities has not done enough in this area. And the third area that I talk about is our training, our external orientations, and our overall resources. But I won't go into too much of nuts and bolts in this talk. As I said, when our respected chairman suggested I'd speak for 40 minutes, I had no desire to do that. What I really wanted to do was to lay out some outlines and then respond to your questions and concerns, because I feel that the most useful contribution I can make here is to engage with you, people living in Australia who are interested in India, and talk to you about what's on your minds rather than what's on mine. So I have deliberately not said what my arguments are about Pakistan or about China or whatever, in the hope that somebody here is interested enough to ask, and I will respond to that. The other thing that I haven't yet talked about is how I got this book out the last couple of years. I was when I stepped down from government, I started dabbling in putting together a book of my thoughts on foreign policy, but inevitably there were the very many onerous demands upon a member of parliament elected to the lower house in India. We have the most demanding voters in the world, I believe, in Kerala. And so I had a great deal of distractions. And I was sort of writing a bit and stopping and writing a bit and letting weeks go by. And finally my wife, Sunanda, who's here today, said to me, "This is nonsense. If you're doing this, do it with a will. I want the book for my birthday." And that was in January, and her birthday was the 27th of June. So I had to set about it. with a will, and I went through the slightly mad rush of writing till 3 a.m. and waking up at 5 and writing again, and then trying to be an MP the rest of the time. But the result was I was able to give her a copy on her birthday, and I'm delighted she's here to celebrate it with me and with you all today. Thank you for listening to me. I look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tharoor. And now, can we have questions? There are Simone with a microphone here. Okay, the gentleman here.
My name is Pradeep Khanna from Sydney.
Hi.
A question, how different was politics at the UN as compared to politics in India?
Very different. Very different. That's probably true, actually, of the UN and any individual country anyway, because the UN is an international environment, and you really have the politics of diplomacy, that is, of countries pursuing their interests. There is also bureaucratic politics amongst the civil servants of the UN, but that is no different from, I think, what you'd see in any country's bureaucracy. But the politics in the classic sense pursued in a national environment is obviously very different. And I found it hugely educative as well as often challenging to be back in India and to find myself, I was talking to a British MP the other day. There was a parliamentary delegation from the House of Commons that had come by. And he was talking about his surgeries. He sees 9 or 10 people a day, and he gives them appointments at 15-minute intervals. And I thought, my God, he should try being an MP in India. When I see my constituents, I see in a 2.5-hour, 3-hour interval, I see about 300 people. And they don't come with appointments. They cluster around my desk, shoving papers under my nose and demanding my services. And that's the way the scale is different. I represent 2 million people in the Thiruvananthapuram Lok Sabha constituency. The average British MP, I think, represents 100,000 people. My victory margin was about that size. So it's a different scale. The nature of the issues that they have come to me for, and then the challenges of actually implementing policies. Parliamentary debate, too, has been very different from anything you'll do with the UN. Partly because, of course, ours is a very rowdy and raucous parliament. And very often being heard is a challenge, let alone making a compelling point in certain ways. But I found this hugely interesting and in many ways quite rewarding as well. Thanks.
Hi, I am Deepak. I'm doing my PhD here. Okay. My question for you is, recently Manmohan Singh opened up the markets for FDI, but there's been widespread opposition. Beyond politics, what do you think is the reason for such an opposition? Because in my thought, I think it's a good thing for India.
I agree with you. And not only is it a good thing for India, it's something that is extremely common around the world. Something like 190 countries allow FDI, foreign direct investment in retail, and most of them do so at a level of 100%. And here India's willingness to allow foreign investors to come in at 51% is being resisted. It's a reflection both of our populist politics, our catering to vested interests, and our economic illiteracy. I mean, it's all of the above. There is still lurking in the Indian political system a profound suspicion of foreign capital. I mentioned it in my remarks, but it's still there. We still have an active Communist Party that describes almost any foreign economic relationship as inherently exploitative. And that vocabulary, that language is there in many of the parties. If you look at parties like the Trinamool Congress in Bengal or the Samajwadi Party in UP, these are professedly socialist parties whose DNA is about standing up for the common man, the poor person, etc., and who are profoundly unaware that the policies they're advocating will actually keep poor people poor, and that, in fact, one needs to think beyond the failed economic doctrines of the first 4.5 decades of India's independence to the doctrines that actually succeeded in the last 2 decades. But sadly, that is not where we are. And it's an uphill challenge. Even within the ruling party, there are many elements in the Congress party who consider this a betrayal of time-honored Congress socialist principles. The Congress party that rules my state of Kerala, for example, has already announced it will not implement this decision. The government very wisely said it's a national policy, but each state is free to decide whether to permit investors. And the fact is that the fundamental problem also is that our politicians are helped and financed and supported by the very people who feel they have most to fear from foreign direct investment. Middlemen for example, who are the ones who make the biggest profits in our current retail industry. To some degree, there is concern about the mom-and-pop stores, the kirane ki dukan, the corner shops, the fear that they will be drummed out by the Walmarts, which I think is actually not only ill-founded as a fear, but has actually been given the lie by detailed studies that have been conducted in countries similar to India, from China to Thailand. In a country like India, it is almost impossible to imagine the corner storekeeper being done out of business, because Walmart will not be able to set up a huge establishment across the street from him. Walmart will be where they can get land in a congested country like India. It'll probably be outside the city. Families at best will be able to go there once a week or something and stock up in large quantities and come home. When they need daily essentials, they'll still go to the corner shops. So a lot of these fears are not particularly well-founded, but alas, that's what explains the resistance.
Okay.
Thank you.
We'll have Professor Gareth Evans, Natasha Chakku, Professor Arun Sharma, and then I'll announce the next order, and Para Wells, so that we have a little more gender balance here as well.
Shashi, I'll ask you for a moment about one of my current preoccupations, which is nuclear disarmament. How comfortable do you feel with current Indian policy, which on the one hand is to invoke regularly the shade of Rajiv Gandhi and say how horrible these inhumane weapons are and how they must be rid from the face of the earth, but on the other hand to be deeply relaxed and comfortable about their continued possession, partly invoking the need to keep up with Pakistan, so you've got a mini arms race now developing, partly because of unstated anxieties, or often stated anxieties, increasingly about China. But really, one suspects it's more about status, prestige, and testosterone than anything else. But what have you got to say about all of that in your current incarnation?
I was expecting that Gareth would either ask me about nuclear disarmament or about morality in foreign policy, and we got A rather than B. But anyway, Gareth, I love crossing swords with you on these things. But let me say, first of all, that as far as the nuclear disarmament conviction is concerned, India genuinely believes that the best world would be a nuclear-free world, and that if all those who possess nuclear weapons were prepared to disarm, India would be very happy to join them in doing so. And I know that's an absolutely sincerely held belief. We also have seen, however, that instead of any genuine commitment to disarmament, the existing nuclear powers have preferred a system of nuclear apartheid, where they have created the NPT as sort of the enshrinement of apartheid in international law, where they've said it's okay for us to have it, but you little people of other colors, you shall have to stay away from this dreadful weapon. Only we are responsible enough to have it. And I'm afraid that is simply unacceptable to us. So in principle, we reject the notion that this is a weapon that some are entitled to hold, but others are not. We are very happy with the principle that no one should have this weapon. But if anyone should have it, and if we say, oh, but it's not realistic to expect the Americans to give up their nukes, well, in that case, it's not realistic to expect us to give up our nukes either. The final point is that when it comes to the strategic imperative, we're actually not in an arms race because there is no strong constituency in our government for spending resources on developing nuclear weapons. So we have a very minimal deterrent. According to, I'm not citing any official accessed information, intelligence information, anything like that, but people who study this carefully tell me that Pakistan has at least 4 times the number of nuclear weapons as we have, perhaps 5, and that China has God knows how many dozen times what we have. So we're not credibly building up a race. We are using the possession of nuclear weapons as, at least in theory, a deterrent that, 1 or 2 might be enough to forestall any attempt at nuclear blackmail of us, and that in practice, we don't expect to fight a nuclear war. Now, there are many Indian military people who are very frustrated by this, who want us to have a much more credible nuclear strategic doctrine, and who are also worried about Pakistan's move towards the development of tactical nuclear battlefield weapons, which would be extremely worrying. Because the Pakistanis genuinely believe they can risk a conventional war with India in which they can have mini nukes to get rid of our tanks, that could actually increase the risk of conventional war. So there are genuine worries in India. But I'm sorry to say that I don't think, I'm sorry from the point of view of those who care about things like nuclear military doctrine. I don't think India is doing very much about that. In fact, there is more energy behind reiterating the Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan of 1988 than there is behind seriously developing a nuclear command system, a nuclear strategy, anything like that. But the bottom line does remain, I think, that we are committed to disarmament if everybody else will do it, but as long as any country feels entitled to have nuclear weapons, then we feel we're no less than any of them.
Natasha?
Mr. Tharoor, my name is Natasha and I'm from PTI. My question to you is, you have been a diplomat, you are a politician, and you have been an author as well. Which role you have enjoyed the most? And do we see your return to MEA in near future?
Remember tomorrow's headlines.
That's right, PTI. Look, first of all, I see myself as a human being with a number of responses to the world, some of which have manifested in my work, whether for refugees, whether in peacekeeping, whether at the various other responsibilities the UN gave me, and some of which I manifest through my writing. In other words, it's the same person responding to the world in different ways. And I see my writing as a part of my response to what I see around me, just as much as I see my professional work, and now in politics, as a response to the world I see around me. I have always been somebody who has wanted to be engaged. I remember a reviewer in the Washington Post once wrote how much more I might have accomplished as an author if I had given up my day job, as he put it. But the fact is that the day job was, in fact, fundamental to who I am, and the writing is something that equally matters. In fact, on my writing, I often like citing George Bernard Shaw, who said that I write for the same reason a cow gives milk. You know, it's inside me, it's got to come out. That's the only way I know how to express what's inside me. But at the same time, I'd be in real pain if I didn't, as a cow would be if she were not milked. So all of this, therefore, means that both aspects are vital to my sense of who I am. And I have enjoyed some things less and some things more in everything I've done. But of course, writing is, at the end, perhaps the most enduring of it all, because, I'm a former UN Under-Secretary General, I'm a former minister. I one day will be a former MP, I have no doubt about it, but I certainly hope I'll never be a former writer.
Yeah, Professor Arun Sharma.
Arun Sharma from Queensland University of Technology. Mr. Tharoor, I wanted to ask you to comment on the evolving nature of diplomacy in the age of social media.
Sorry, the what nature of diplomacy?
Of diplomacy.
The what nature? What is it?
The evolving nature of diplomacy.
Evolving nature,
yeah.
I'm sorry.
In the days of social media. And I'll paraphrase my question by some thoughts here. Given the demographic profile in the West, which is aging, and China is aging even faster, and given where India is a youthful nation, the future of perhaps every Western country is a bit more Indian, because that's where we are going to get the workforce. Now, when this happens, and there's nothing new about migration of this scale, it has happened for centuries, but it is now happening in the age of social media, where you have a very active and vigorous Indian press that feels responsible about how the Indian diaspora is traveling in every country. And the challenges that one faces when one moves to another country in large groups can often be a difficult transition. And we are living in an age where we are sharing each and everything that we do today via social media with people back home. And things are likely to erupt because there is a highly overactive media, and also the media here doesn't know how to react to what is happening there. How do you see the diplomatic forces, both in India and in the West, are going to address some of these new challenges, or if there are any new challenges here?
Yes, I'm pleased to say that some of this is actually addressed in my book, Pax Indica, because I talk about public diplomacy and diplomacy through social media. And of course, one should never put these things into print because they'll be out of date within a week of the book's coming out, since there's so much evolving in this area. But first, to address the premise of your question that every country is going to be a little more Indian, it's an interesting premise because, in fact, yes, 65% of our population is under 35. We have 540 million people under 25. So there's no doubt that, in theory, India will be host to the world's workforce, the youthful, energetic, dynamic, productive age people at a time when the rest of the globe is aging, including China, which is aging pretty rapidly right now and is also facing the challenge of one person, one son, supporting 4 grandparents, which is going to cause other social frictions in China as well. So there's no question that all that is true, but that demographic dividend will only work for India if we get the basics right and we do everything we can to train and educate these young people so they can make that contribution meaningfully and they can take advantage of the opportunities of the 21st century. And I would be irresponsible to suggest we're doing anything remotely like getting that right just yet. So we first need to do that. Having said that, yes, diplomacy is changing with social media. It's very instructive, for example, that so many countries have now got an active social media process. There are foreign ministers who have their own blogs. Pretty much every foreign minister now is on Twitter. When I went on Twitter, I was almost ridiculed in India. Now, literally, I mean, I have so many foreign minister friends I'm engaging with on Twitter. We've got ambassadors in certain countries being instructed by their foreign officers to go on social media, to have a presence on social media. And even good old India has woken up to this. We have our public diplomacy division now has a Twitter account. Our spokesperson has a Twitter account. And most Indian embassies and consulates, I think, are obliged to have web pages. So there's a genuine change in all of this. To what degree is this going to be a substitute for traditional diplomacy? I would argue probably not. I think it's going to be an add-on. You know, all the things you need to do diplomatically you will still continue doing. Foreign ministers will still speak to each other and meet and not just conduct diplomacy by Twitter. There will still be summits and conferences and all of that, and there will be all the hard stuff that goes on bilaterally between countries. But the element of public diplomacy that social media makes possible will actually create a situation in which more and more countries in the world will have populations that care about international affairs, that are engaged with it, and that world leaders feel obliged to relate to. And that's a very healthy sign of deepening democratization of diplomacy, which certainly is vastly different from what would have happened 20 years ago.
The lady there, yes?
Mr. Tharoor, thank you very much for an interesting presentation.
Could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Nava Subramaniam. I'm from Deakin University. I'm Director for Research Center there. I'm very interested in knowing your views on corporate social responsibility and how corporate India is dealing with it, particularly with the proposed companies bill that requires quite a substantial amount of their net profits to be set aside to advance corporate social responsibility.
Well, I'm in favor of corporate social responsibility, but I'm not in favor of that bill. And I'll tell you why. I think corporate social responsibility is sort of the conscience of the company. The idea is that the company is a good citizen, does its work, but makes an effort out of its profits to contribute to the well-being of the communities which it's in, or even the country more broadly understood. And we, when I was at the United Nations, were very active in something called the Global Compact, which laid out certain important principles, human rights principles, labor standards, environmental principles, and so on, which companies had to uphold as signatories to the Global Compact. And this is something which was complemented then by doing things for people outside the workplace, which is where corporate social responsibility comes in. The problem with this bill is, by mandating it as a matter of law, it does two things. First, in effect, it becomes an additional tax on a company. If a company is serving in your country, it pays its taxes, it has done, in my view, its legal obligations. Thereafter, the joy of corporate social responsibility is that it works voluntarily, that companies do something they don't have to do, but they do it to help people, and they earn goodwill that way. It seems to me they'll earn much less goodwill if they're simply doing it because the law obliges them to do it. And I'm very troubled by the logic of that. It seems to me that what we need to do is encourage companies to do certain things, but not always do it by fiat.
Yeah, sorry, Manpreet.
How? Because quite simply, the goodwill that is earned, the publicity, the positive feedback is something which some companies enjoy because they do it, and some companies don't because they don't do it. And that's the difference it makes. Now, if they're paying taxes, the taxes can be spent for certain purposes, but they get no credit for that. To do corporate social responsibility by law means that they're in effect spending something because the government has told them to spend it and not otherwise. And I'm not sure that's necessarily very good.
I knew you wouldn't ignore me for that much longer. My name is Manpreet. I work with SBS. I'm a broadcaster here. India, we very well know, is a land of paradoxes. I don't need to go about the extremes. We all know about that. What I find hard to fathom is a country that spends so much on its military nuclear programs. You're saying that they don't spend too much in foreign policy, in diplomats, or even engaging within the country. I find it hard to fathom, why does India have such a large space program? Why is traveling to the moon or going to Mars so much more important when the country still doesn't provide water, sanitation, hygiene, health, education in villages?
This is an old conundrum, Mantri. The fact is that every country, and the US is no exception, has not allowed its aspirations, its dreams, to be bogged down by the least pleasant of its realities. In other words, there was still poverty in Appalachia and in Harlem when John F. Kennedy announced a desire to send a man to the moon. And India has always felt that it has a deep obligation to the poorest of its poor to pull them out of poverty, but it also has an obligation to fulfill its potential, the talents of its scientists and its abilities. If you didn't have a space program, a satellite program, and so on, what might you be depriving your own people of? Now, India, for example, has now become one of the top 3 or 4 in the world in satellite technology. Developed countries are coming to India to launch their satellites from India, which is an extraordinary accomplishment for a developing country with the poverty it has. We are one of the world leaders in outer space issues. We have therefore got a special contribution to make to these things at the global level. I find this actually quite reasonable. You say India is spending so much on its military and its space. It's actually not. India has one of the lowest military budgets in the world as a percentage of GDP. It's barely 2% of GDP. Most countries spend double that as a percentage of their GDP on defense. So India is not an excessively wasteful country when it comes to military expenditure. It's a country which has these paradoxes that you talked about. It is a country that will have people hoeing the fields with technology that hasn't changed in 2,000 years, and you'll have people going after the moon as well. That aspiration level is also part of what India is all about. But I think if you reduce everything in a country, and as I said, it's not just India, any country, to its lowest common denominator, you see, you cannot do X until you've done Y, you're hobbling yourself in ways that no country in the world currently permits himself to do.
We've really time for only 2 or 3 more.
No, I don't mind staying on a bit more. There's so many hands up.
Okay, I'll yeah. Para Wells, the gentleman here, Marsha Thompson, Ravi Bhatia, and Steve Howard, and 1 or 2 others, and this gentleman here.
We did start late.
Yeah. The only thing is that
thank you, Amitabh, and hello, Shashi.
Hello, please introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Para Wells, and it's lovely to see you here, Shashi. I like your use of the World Wide Web as a metaphor for global interconnections. We are witnessing a very strange worldwide phenomenon of Islamic protests and attacks on US embassies. They are apparently reacting to an offensive video on YouTube. Could you tell us what you think is really happening and why, and how it has happened so quickly?
Yeah, I actually haven't seen the video and don't intend to, but the fact is that there are people who are constantly testing how thin the skin is of those who are prepared to be offended. And I'm afraid we see this in the domestic Indian context as well, and with the Islamic world, we've seen it internationally. We saw it first over the Danish cartoons, you remember, a few years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, and we're seeing it now over this video. And, you know, it's all very well for people to say, as I do, that instead of being offended, why don't you just turn it off and not watch it? But the truth is that people find the very existence of an insult to their prophet to be something that they have to object to. And it becomes then a sort of flashpoint, a touchstone that generates other feelings that go beyond the specific object. Obviously, the Western world explains that this is not an officially sponsored video. The State Department and various American embassies have condemned it, have issued statements distancing themselves from it. But that doesn't, in fact, anymore seem relevant to the protesters, who are at some level reacting to the very existence of something, and therefore to the existence of a system that can permit such a something to be made. And that rage manifests itself. It will spend itself before too long, But in the meantime, we will have seen some tragic loss of life, as we know, some destruction, some serious damage to perceptions around the world that Huntington was wrong and that we're not condemned to clashes of civilizations. But I'm afraid that this is something we're going to have to live with periodically. Every time somebody desecrates a Quran or makes a film insulting the Prophet or whatever, somebody will use that as a catalyst to set off rage. And I'm afraid there's no way out of this because Western canons of free speech will ensure there's always room for some idiot to do something like this. And Islamic sensitivities will mean there's always some idiot willing to whip up a mob in protest to it. And the rest of us will watch these two sets of idiots and despair.
Well, we are launching your book in Australia, Shashi. There's been a global launch of Salman Rushdie's memoir.
Yes.
Today, Joseph Anton. But the gentleman here.
All right. In relation to Burma.
Please identify yourself.
All right. In relation to Burma.
Please introduce yourself.
Okay. I'm Sharon, working at the University of South Australia, Adelaide. In relation to Burma, is it wise to say that economic development is much easier way to win hearts and minds of the people rather than using sanction and forcing the rulers in the arms of those who supports the ruler? So why don't we differentiate between economics and the foreign relations? Foreign relations can go differently, and economic development helps people to.
It's a very tough call. It's a very tough call because you can't just look at Burma in isolation. You're asking a question of principle. And the principle about sanctions has always been that sanctions are required in order to make life tougher for the ruling class, the ones who are imposing injustice upon their people. Now, the counter-argument has been used cynically by some and idealistically by others in various cases. You remember that when countries like India advocated sanctions on South Africa, that the Western argument was engagement was the answer. Well, engagement didn't work for many decades, and it was only when two sets of sanctions, the sporting sanctions that affected the national honor of South African whites, and then the financial sanctions that made the capitalists in Johannesburg unable to raise any money on international markets. It's only when those two sanctions began to bite that South Africa finally began to relax the iron grip of apartheid on its black and colored peoples. So one could argue sanctions worked in South Africa. You could argue that sanctions didn't work in Burma because, in fact, Burma had an isolationist regime that was quite happy not to have to deal with the rest of the world and was doing all its trade in timber and precious metals across the border with Thailand and so on, and didn't worry about sanctions. And certainly they did not relax their grip on people with sanctions, and they've only begun to relax their grip now that the world is actually engaging with them. So there are examples, I'm afraid, on both sides of this debate. The only answer I can give you is that you will have to look at everything on a case-by-case basis, look at what works in a particular situation, what has worked or has not worked, see whether you've tried one approach and tried the other. There are sanctions, I remember the sanctions on Serbia, for example, caused enormous havoc to ordinary people, but the regime was left relatively untouched because they were able to corner enough for themselves to be able to continue while old-age pensioners were committing suicide because their life savings could no longer buy a loaf of bread with the inflation that sanctions brought into Serbia. So you just cannot give a one-size-fits-all answer on sanctions.
Marsha Thompson, State Member of Parliament.
How are you, Shashi? It's good to see you again.
Good to see you again.
My question goes back to your issue about whether India is getting the basics right. And given a rising middle class in India and a very youthful one, what are the basics that India needs to get right? Good luck solving that in 5 seconds or 10 or 20 years perhaps. But I guess my issue is, given aspirational determinants around the globe are changing with multimedia and social media, it's also occurring in India. And so there will be a demand to expect more from government, from business and general outcomes. What happens if India gets it wrong to the community and that active democracy that is India, and how do you get it right?
Right. Well, Marsha, the thing is that we need to get everything right. I mean, what one might call the hardware of development, the ports, the roads, the railways, the infrastructure, all of that, as well as the software of development, the human capital without which there is no real development. And that includes principally doing things like education, training, because not everybody is going to come out with a college degree, and if they did, they wouldn't have jobs. We actually are facing today a nationwide shortage of masons, for example. We don't have enough masons. We don't have enough plumbers. We have a civilizational tradition that a plumber or a carpenter or a cobbler or whatever learns his profession from his father or his uncle. There is no nationwide system of vocational training, for example. So if you have the talent to do that, you have no real way of apprenticing yourself to somebody who will teach you. This sort of thing becomes a real problem. But if we can get those basics right, I think we're well on the way. And in fact, the whole notion that there may be 500 million Indian villagers who are poised to enter the global village is a very sobering thought. It will have an impact not only on their lives and their fortunes, but on the rest of the world in the next couple of decades.
Ravi Bhatia, and then this gentleman.
Hi, Ravi Bhatia. Shashi, you've addressed a number of questions with in-depth answers and sought to address lots of misconceptions, be it India's nuclear policy or be it India's armament spending. Thank you for that. Now, considering that you are an effective communicator, why wouldn't you consider being India's Prime Minister?
I'm not sure that...
That's a loaded question.
I'm not sure that the premise of your question... I'm not sure the premise of your question stands up. First of all, is it up to any individual to consider such a thing? Or is it up to the party? Secondly, is it up to any effective communicator to get into government? In our country, we have actually set very little store by communication as an aspect of political leadership. One of the more unusual differences between Indian democracy and Western democracies is that we actually don't particularly seem to value communication. That somebody who communicates effectively, whether on television or to a mass audience, is usually not entrusted with leadership. It's the strong, silent type that we particularly prefer. So if you say, given the one, how about the other, you're very kind, but I think I'll pass to that point.
Yeah.
My name is Sridhar Subramaniam. I'm an enlightened global citizen.
Glad to hear it.
Presently living in Melbourne, Australia. India is a force to reckon with in the international arena and is holding its head high in the Committee of Nations. Your elevation to the Secretary Generalship would have been a fitting recognition of India's new emerging status. What went wrong? Was India not able to use its clout to pull it off?
There's a lot that can be said about that I'd rather not say right now in public. But having said that, to some degree, yes, there are political calculations. This is not about the most appropriate resume. This is not a job you submit a biodata for. It is a job in which governments make certain political calculations as to who they want to see in that particular thing, and very often it's the nationality that does influence that decision. So you're asking the question is appropriate because clearly, though I was a known figure within the UN, to the ambassadors casting the vote, the ones in the capitals making the decision were as concerned, I'm sure, about their orientation to the nationalities of the candidates concerned. It was a good race. It was worth fighting, I thought. It was worth entering. I came second in a field of 7 that included a deputy prime minister and a clutch of foreign ministers and a serving head of state of a government, president of Latvia, and a prince to boot. So I have no complaints. I didn't do too badly. But in the end, the fellow who got more votes won.
Steve Howard.
No, that train has left the station.
Final 2 questions. Steve Howard and...
Shashi, Steve Howard from the Global Foundation. Hello. Towards a grand strategy for India in the 21st century, your final chapter heading. That in itself is fascinating to tie together the threads of what you've been talking about tonight. But it's also interesting because many of us here in Australia are thinking and talking about Australia in the same terms at the moment. An Australian grand strategy which is built around being global in the first instance, particularly around the G20, as a strategic decision-making body rather than a management agency, incidentally. You haven't mentioned Australia, I think, only perhaps in passing. What's the point of intersection between India's potential grand strategy and Australia's grand strategy for the 21st century?
a tough one because neither country seems to impinge as much on the other's consciousness, politically or diplomatically, as it might otherwise have done, to make the question easy to answer. Right now, the two countries have overcome the one recent setback in their relationship, which was the mass hysteria in the Indian media about assaults on Indians in cities like Melbourne and Sydney. And now that that's subsided, we've gone back to thinking of Australia as this wonderful country we like playing cricket with. There's no real other issue that bedevils our relationship. We've had a fair number of visitors from the Australian government to India, to Delhi in recent years. The Prime Minister is coming again next month. She's been there before. I think there's a certain interest level in the relationship in taking it to a further stage or a step forward, which I think is very healthy and welcome. In addition to that, you've got trade potential, which is not inconsiderable. You've got investment potential in both directions, but certainly, I see a friend from Invest Victoria right here, and the fact is that there are Indian companies coming in the IT field. There are Indian mining majors looking with great interest at Australia because of the huge political hassles attendant upon mining in India, and so on. So there is greater potential for India to invest in Australia. And strategically, there have been one or two naval exercises which haven't continued. It was suggested at one point that Australia wasn't very keen on continuing them. So maybe that again suggests that there are some limitations to the level of interest that exists. But I would argue that the potential is very much there. And we start off with the given that there is no real problem dividing us. We broadly have the same orientations towards the world and towards Asia. And we could well find ourselves intersecting initially in Southeast Asia, where there are emerging groupings and formulations in which we could play a common part. But beyond that, it's difficult for me to suggest that a major element of either country's grand strategy would yet be the other. But it could become, and we need to work on it.
One final, and you'll have to really make it quick because we
Absolutely. Good evening, Dr. Tharoor. My name is Shireen. I'm of the general public. First of all, and I'm pretty sure I'm speaking for all of us, if not most of us, that you certainly have inspired us to get a copy of the book.
Right outside.
Preferably an autographed one. And while some of us are nominating you to be the Prime Minister of India and wondering why you did not become the Secretary General of the UN, I thought I'd put you in a tighter spot there. If you could provide, as a former external minister, if you could provide one long-term solution to improve the relations between India and Pakistan, what would that be?
Well, as an Indian, there are limitations to anything that I could accomplish because the problem with Pakistan, in my view, and I argue this at great length in the book, is that the difficulties between our two countries lie in the nature of the Pakistani state itself. In India, the state has an army. In Pakistan, the army has a state. They've ruled it for the majority of the years of its existence, and that's a paraphrase of Voltaire on Prussia before anyone accuses me of plagiarism. But they've ruled it for a majority of the years of its existence, and they have controlled it when they've not been directly ruling by telling the government how far it could go, what sort of red lines the government could not cross, and so on. And no civilian government to date has served an entire term in Pakistan. They've always been turfed out of office when the military deemed it necessary to do so. On top of that, you don't join the army in Pakistan to defend the country. You join the army to run the country. Not just run the government, but as Shashi Tharoor has described in a remarkable book a few years ago, the Pakistani army controls everything from real estate transactions, petrol pumps, import-export trade, universities and think tanks. They're everywhere. And as a result, the Pakistani military controls a larger share of its own country's GDP and its own country's government budget than any army in the world does of any other country. How do you justify this disproportionate dominance of your society? By manufacturing threats on your borders. So the Pakistani military, for its own survival and its own continued domination of Pakistan, direct or indirect, requires problems on the Indian side and on the Afghan side of the border. And this has been, sadly, the reality of India. So India has a different perspective. India's perspective is there's nothing Pakistan has that we want. So the notion of an Indian threat is a joke because we don't have anything to threaten them for. What we want is basically to be allowed to get on with our business of development, of solving our problems and so on. And we want to avoid having a hostile neighbor because we know that if things go out of control, investors are not going to come into a war zone. We want to remain an attractive country for investment and trade and so on. Given that, what we want, we need to pursue peace. And I argue in the book that we need to have a realistic case for peace. We know that we talk to the civilian government doesn't get very far. When Vajpayee took the bus across the border to Pakistan, a few months later we were rewarded with the Kargil infiltration, which led to our last war with them, 1999. When Manmohan Singh had extensive talks with President Musharraf and then with President Zardari, including the famous back-channel talks that began imagining the unimaginable, a peace settlement on Kashmir, what happened? We were given 26/11, the monstrous attack on Mumbai by Pakistani-trained, financed, equipped, and directed terrorists who killed 188 Indians in the commercial capital of the country. So I'm afraid we know that trying to make diplomatic peace with the government of the day does not buy us real peace with the elements in Pakistan that want to do us harm. The fact is that Pakistan may not anymore control some of these characters. You know, the old legend of Frankenstein's monster, once the monster has been built, he may escape the control of his creators, and that seems to be happening. But given that, there are limitations to how much we can do through the kinds of diplomacy we've attempted. I nonetheless argue that we need to be generous. We need to open up our markets, for example. And I'll tell you why. When 26/11 happened, for example, India shut down essentially everything with Pakistan, diplomatic contacts, trade relationships, everything. No one in Pakistan had anything to lose. Nobody had a stake in India. So I say, let's open up our markets to them. If there's an entire capitalist establishment in Pakistan, influential, well-connected, rich, that is making money hand over fist by selling goods to India, they will become a peace constituency because they will be telling the ISI, the notorious Pakistani military intelligence group that's behind much of the terrorism militancy in the region, that your military adventurism is hurting my pocketbook, is hurting my wallet. And they will become a constituency for peace, in my view, if we encourage the creation of such a constituency. So my argument is very much not a candlelight at Wagah border kind of argument. I have no illusions about Pakistan, but it's an argument for peace in our interest and for doing it by helping create a peace constituency across the border. So that is something they'll have to do, not us.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Dr. Tharoor. And Sunanda Pushkar, a fellow Kashmiri. The book is a gift for you, and thank you very much for ensuring that the book was completed in time. Dr. Behra, the Honorable Consul General, the Chairman of the Australia-India Institute, Robert Johansson, and all our other distinguished fellows, including Professor Gareth Evans, Maxine McHugh, and thank you all for coming to this wonderful event. And there are copies of Pax Indica available outside. Thank you.